Some revolutions start with a bang, a massive explosion. But this story is about a revolution that began with a polite request. We're diving into the Indian National Congress, the party that would eventually lead India to freedom. But its beginnings are a total puzzle. A quiet, almost controversial meeting that somehow set the stage for one of the biggest independence movements in history.
And right away, you hit this massive contradiction. The very party that came to define Indian nationalism was co-founded by a member of the ruling class, a retired British civil servant named Alan Octavian Hume. So, what was his deal? Was he a genuine ally, a man ahead of his time? Or was this entire project a trap from the very beginning?
To really get this, we've got to rewind a bit. The huge, violent revolt of 1857 left some deep scars on both sides. By the 1870s, a new generation of educated Indians was emerging, and they were looking for a way to get involved politically, but without starting another massive conflict. And then, boom, 1885. A.O. Hume shows up, gathers 72 delegates in Bombay, and the Indian National Congress is born. But that just leads us right back to the big question: why a British guy?
And this question, it's not just a footnote. It kicks off one of the biggest debates in all of Indian history. Was the Congress a clever British invention to let off some steam and keep control, or was it actually an Indian masterstroke to survive British suspicion? This is the heart of the mystery, the safety valve versus the lightning conductor theory.
Okay, so the first theory is the safety valve. Think of it like this. After the absolute shock of 1857, the British were terrified of another rebellion. So the theory goes they got Hume to create the Congress as a sort of controlled outlet, a political pressure cooker. It would let educated Indians vent all their frustrations in a safe, official space, and that would keep the pressure from building up and exploding again.
And look, this wasn't some fringe idea people whispered about. It became a really powerful accusation. Later on, more radical nationalists, guys like Lala Lajpat Rai, were absolutely convinced of it. To them, the polite, collaborative start of the Congress was all the proof they needed that it was a conspiracy, designed to protect the British Empire, not to tear it down. But then you've got the complete flip side, the lightning conductor theory. This version paints a totally different picture. It says the early Indian leaders were the real chess masters here. They knew that any political group that was 100% Indian would probably get crushed by a paranoid British government. So they used Hume, a Brit, as a shield. He would attract all the government's suspicion, all the hostility, acting like a lightning conductor that let their new movement safely grow in the shadows.
So, you see, it all comes down to motive. Was it about British control or Indian protection? Was it a colonial idea or a nationalist strategy? One theory makes the founders look like puppets. The other makes them look like political geniuses. The real truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But this big question really hung over the party for a long time.
Okay, so whatever the real story of its birth was, for its first 20 years, the Congress was defined by one group, the moderates. And their whole style of politics, well, it was something we would never really see again.
So, who were these moderates? Well, think of these brilliant Western-educated men like Dadabhai Naoroji and G.K. Gokhale. They were lawyers, intellectuals, and they genuinely admired British democracy. But, and this is a huge but, they were an elite group, pretty much completely disconnected from the lives of ordinary Indians. And their guiding light, the thing that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, was this deep faith in the fairness of the very empire they were trying to reform.
This right here gets to the core of how they thought. The moderates didn't want to end British rule. Their argument was that British rule in India was being un-British. They believed the colonial government was portraying the very ideals of liberty and justice that made Britain, well, Britain. Their goal wasn't independence. It was to make the British in India actually live up to their own standards.
So how were they going to do this? Through their famous 3 Ps method. First up, prayer, which wasn't literal prayer. It just meant submitting very polite appeals. If that didn't work, you moved on to petition, gathering signatures for formal demands. The final step was protest, but forget everything you think you know about protests. This was constitutional agitation, writing fiery articles, giving speeches, always working within the system. It was patient, methodical, and totally non-confrontational.
Now, I know what you're thinking. The 3 Ps sound, well, pretty tame, right? Even weak. But here's the thing. Out of this patient academic approach came the moderates' single most powerful weapon, a devastating economic takedown of the entire British Empire.
And the man at the center of this was Dadabhai Naoroji with his groundbreaking book. And notice that title again, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. See, he wasn't just making an emotional plea. He came with receipts. He used cold, hard data to prove that British rule was systematically draining India dry.
This drain of wealth theory was an absolute game changer. For the first time, someone actually did the math. Nauroji added up the enormous salaries and pensions paid to British officials, all of it sent back home to Britain. He tracked the profits from rigged trade deals. He tallied up the insane cost of India funding Britain's imperial wars. It was like a giant financial pipeline, sucking wealth out of India and sending it straight to Britain, year after year. This wasn't just a complaint, it was an economic indictment, and it completely changed how a generation of Indians saw the empire.
So after all this patient, methodical work, did they actually get anywhere? The answer is, kinda. Their biggest political victory was the Indian Councils Act of 1892. On paper, it looked like a step forward, but in reality, it was a masterclass in giving with one hand and taking away with the other.
Just look at this breakdown. It shows you the gap between how things looked and how they really were. Sure, Indians got more seats on government councils, and they got the right to discuss the budget. But look at what they didn't get. The British kept their official majority, so they could never be outvoted. Indians could talk about the money, but they had zero power to vote on it. They could ask a question, but they were literally forbidden from asking a follow-up. It was the perfect illusion of power, with absolutely no real substance.
So, when we look back at this first phase of the Indian National Congress, how should we judge them? They were the pioneers, no doubt, but their legacy is complicated. They were building a foundation, for sure, but it was a foundation with some serious cracks. This quote from the British Viceroy at the time, Lord Dufferin, just nails it. He dismissed the Congress as a microscopic minority. Now, he meant it as a total insult, but he was also accidentally telling the truth. The moderates represented a tiny, tiny fraction of the population, and that failure to connect with the masses, that would turn out to be their fatal flaw.
So here it is, the final balance sheet. On the plus side, their contributions were historic. They blew the lid off the economic rot of colonialism, they created the first ever truly national political platform, and they laid the intellectual groundwork for nationalism. But the minus column is just as important. They totally failed to inspire the masses. Their gentle methods were way too easy for the British to just ignore, and that deep faith in British justice, in the end, it was just heartbreakingly naive. I think the best way to see the moderates is this. They weren't the stars of the show. They weren't the revolutionaries. Their gains were small, and their approach was super cautious. But by creating a national platform and a powerful argument against colonial rule, they built the stage. They wrote the opening act, and without them, the main event could never have begun. Which leaves us with one final, crucial question. The moderates had laid the foundation of Indian nationalism, piece by patient piece. But a foundation is not a house. Who is going to come next to build upon it with more radical tools and a much more aggressive design? Well, that's a story for another time.